Welcome to a Battlefield Tour World War I edition. Unlike previous wars we have studied, World War I marks a turning point in battles and warfare, as new technological advancements in science led to more modern and deadly forms of fighting. This presentation will guide you through the most iconic battles of the Western Front and explore the significance of these battles, not only in the context of the war, but also in the development of modern warfare. This lesson will be divided into two guided activities. In the first part of the lesson, we will annotate a map as we go over the most important battles of the Western Front. In the second part of the lesson, we will conduct a class discussion to discover which battle was the most significant of the war. Gather your paper map and markers from the center of the table. Write your name in the appropriate box, and use the space below each battle name to write down any notes. Ready? Let's get started. It is impossible to go through the progression of the battles during the war by simply talking about them. In order to help you understand the significance of each battle, you will be asked to mark a map to show the geographic location and year of each battle in black, and we'll use a color code to mark the victor: green for an ally win, blue for Central Powers win, and red for a stalemate. If you forget the color code at any time, it is also noted on your map. The Battle of the Frontiers comprised of 5 offensives launched during the first month of the war, August 1914. The battles were launched more or less simultaneously and marked the collision of both French and German invasion plans. The commanders of the German and French armies had believed that the opening encounters of World War I would decide its fate. In the Battle of the Frontiers, the Allies engaged a little over 1 million men, and the Central Powers engaged just under 1 million men. Turning to your elbow partner, briefly discuss who you believe won this face-off. Both sides attacked with ruthless intensity, but French tactical ineptitude, massed infantry attacks against artillery and machine guns, was completely ineffective. The French were using old tactics against new weapons. This opening series of battles was a disaster for the French and the Allies. Since the Central Powers won this battle, write the information in blue. Also, since this was a series of battles, use the arrow to indicate the location of all 5 battles and the relative location of the Western Front. The power of artillery and machine guns was no match for the French infantry. In past wars, the mass of the infantry gave the tactical advantage. However, the introductions of new weapons changed that old golden rule. In addition, while the Allies had a matching number of machine guns, they were embedded randomly in the infantry units. In the German forces, machine guns were under the direct command of senior officers, who could deploy them for strategic effect in the most desired location. Having invaded Belgium and northeastern France, the German army had reached within 30 miles of Paris. For the Central Powers, to capture Paris would mean winning the war. Their progress had been rapid, having successfully beaten back Belgian, French, and British forces and advancing deep into northeastern France. This was in accordance to the Schlieffen Plan, whose primary focus was the swift defeat of France in the west before turning their attention to Russian forces in the east. The French leadership resolved in September to launch a counter-offensive strike. The 1 million man armies faced each other again. Turning to your partner, briefly discuss who you believe won this face-off. In a strategic triumph at the First Battle of the Marne, which ended on September 10, 1914, the French forces, assisted by the British, succeeded in throwing back the German offensive, recapturing lost ground in the process. More importantly, the battle ended any hopes the Germans had of effectively bringing the war on the Western Front to an early close. However, this victory came at a cost, as the movements of forces stalled and the armies started digging trenches that they would occupy for the next few years. Since the Allies won, write your information down in green. The Battle of the Marne is a key turning point in World War I. If the Germans had been able to reach Paris, France would have fallen, and with it the alliance of the Allies. In saving Paris, the Allies had lived to fight another day. However, the German army was not going to retreat or give up ground easily. This led to the creation of trenches, and with it a whole new method of fighting, trench warfare. The military fighting lines consist largely of military trenches, or dugout holes and lines connected to each other, in which troops are well protected from the enemy's small arms fire and are substantially sheltered from artillery. Men would eat, sleep, and wait in muddy pits until they got orders to move on to the next trench. In World War I, both sides constructed elaborate trench, underground, and dugout systems, opposing each other along the front, protected from assault by barbed wire, mines, camouflage trapping pits, and other obstacles. Until tanks and other armored technology was developed, artillery and small arms fire forced combat forces to fight in trenches. With the advent of trench warfare came a new kind of destruction. The opposing armies would shell and drop bombs on each other while in these fortifications. This created a dead zone between the trenches called no man's land. Because the topography of northern France is relatively flat, no man's land was a flat, barren, destroyed, muddy stretch of wasteland where no man could survive. Every time an army launched an offensive, men would have to hike up out of their trenches and run into the enemy's trench without getting blown up or gunned down. The odds of getting across no man's land were slim, and the design of the battlefield made it hard to gain any ground. Over time, a successful offensive equated to yards gained, as opposed to battles won. Men would often take an opposing trench only to abandon it a few days later, gaining almost no progress after 4 years of fighting. This practice gave rise to this period of the war being dubbed as stalemate. Following the German defeat at the Marne, the military strategists turned their attention to the north, to the sea. The so-called race to the sea starts in earnest, to try and overtake the opposing force. Ypres, the site of the meeting point of the armies, had been the scene of multiple battles since the 16th century. The Allied position around Ypres took the shape of a small salient or projection resembling an arrow in the trench lines, because it could be best defended from a low ridge of higher ground to the east. But it was vulnerable to superior German artillery. The armies faced off for 2 months. Turning to your partner, discuss who you think won this battle. The combat during this engagement was extremely confusing and unrelenting and typical of the new stalemate. Less than half of the 160,000 men the BEF sent to France made it back in one piece. After November 1914, the British would come to call these trenches the salient, meaning the position projecting into the enemy's lines, and will remain as Ypres' guardians for the rest of the war. As this battle was a stalemate, write down the information in red. There were eventually 3 major battles at Ypres, but the First Battle of Ypres was one of the most significant. First, Ypres foreshadowed how fighting on the Western Front would play out as the war progressed. The high casualty figures from each participating army, combined with the fighting and living in the trenches, would soon become to dominate the stalemate that was the Western Front. It also highlighted the emotional cost of this kind of new fighting. Men who fought at Ypres would be affected for the rest of their lives, haunted by the horrors they witnessed. The term PTSD was not yet coined. Men simply were referred to as having soldier's heart, or lost men of the lost generation. Verdun was intended to be less of a battle and more like a siege, meaning the Germans' aim was to cut off essential supplies in order to compel the surrender of the French army. Verdun is not a particularly important military target, but it held great symbolic meaning for the French army, as it was the last fortress to fall in the Franco-Prussian War 40 years earlier. If the Germans could capture it first, it would be a fantastic blow to the French morale in an already demoralizing war. After a furious bombardment, 100,000 shells poured into Verdun every hour. It looked as if the Germans would be able to capture Verdun. The commanders were lost, and the battalions had been reduced from 600 to around 180 men. Despite this, the new acting French commander, Pétain, declared, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. Turning to your elbow partner, briefly discuss who you believe won this battle. French casualties during the battle were estimated at over 500,000, with German losses set at over 430,000, half of those being fatalities. The only real effect of the battle was the irrevocable wounding of both armies. No tactical or strategic advantage had been gained by either side. Verdun was the longest battle of the First World War, from February to December 1916, almost a year. Since this battle was a stalemate, write your information down in red. German troops almost succeeded in breaking through the French line at the close of June and into early July. It was at this stage that the latest form of chemical warfare was unveiled by Germany, phosgene gas, which acted by forming hydrochloric acid once inhaled into the lungs. Joffre, meanwhile, pressed the British government to stage a major diversionary offense elsewhere on the Western Front to serve as a drain on German manpower. Originally scheduled for August, the Battle of the Somme was brought forward to July upon the insistence of the French. The Battle of the Somme was the main Allied offensive during 1916. This battle, first conceived as an attack by the French and British armies, turned into a planned distraction by the British army from the fighting at Verdun, where the Germans had promised to bleed France white. The Allied forces bombarded German fortifications and expected little to no resistance when crossing no man's land. Turning to your partner, discuss briefly who you think won this battle. However, the bombardment had failed, and the offensive turned into a turkey shoot for German forces, who easily picked off British soldiers crossing the trenches laden with supplies. With the original push failing, this battle quickly turned into a stalemate. The fighting continued for months. While brand new newly designed tanks did help the British Army in mid-September, the battle had started in July, they saw little progress and were not able to capitalize on any of the small victories they gained. Since this battle was a stalemate, write your information down in red. This was an extremely hard battle for the British Army. On the first day of the battle, the UK lost over 57,000 men, or 60% of the men available, half of them which were killed. This is still to this day the most costly one-day casualty toll of any war. Despite the slow but progressive British advance, poor weather, snow, brought to a halt the Somme offensive in mid-November. During the attack, the British and French had gained 12 kilometers, or 6 miles, of ground, the taking of which resulted in over 400,000 estimated British casualties, including many of the volunteers' PAL battalions from the colonies, plus a further 200,000 French casualties. The German casualties were estimated to run around 500,000. Overall, over 1 million men lost at the Battle of the Somme. It was truly hell on earth. As you can see from the amount of red on your map, the war on the Western Front was comprised mainly by a series of demoralizing stalemates. The USA entered the war in 1917 on the side of the Allies, after Congress feared an alliance between a victorious Germany and Mexico would threaten its sovereignty. This was a godsend to the Allied forces, who were exhausted after 3 years of brutal fighting. However, the U.S. forces lacked experience, and Belleau would prove a test of the Americans' abilities as Germany mobilized to push towards Paris one more time. Turn to your partner and briefly discuss who you think won this battle. Despite their lack of experience, the fresh American forces were vigorous and committed to a victory. By the end of the 20-day battle, U.S. forces had suffered close to 10,000 casualties, of which 1,800 were fatal. The German number of casualties is not known, although some 1,600 troops were taken prisoner. More critically, this action brought an end to the last major German offensive of the war. Since this battle was won by the Allies, write your information in green. The Battle of Belleau Wood marks the first real fighting test for American Marines on an international stage. Legend and lore has it that the Germans used the term Teufelsschund, or devil dogs, for the Marines. The term was not commonly known in contemporary German. Regardless of the term's origin, 10 years after the battle, Lieutenant Colonel Otto from the historical section of the German army wrote of the Marine Corps, "Their fiery advance and great tenacity were well recognized by their opponents." This helped grow America's international importance in world affairs, especially as it related to military alliances. The final stand between the armies occurred in a familiar spot, the Marne. With the Germans having ultimately failed in their efforts to break through, the Allied Supreme Commander authorized a counter-offensive on July 18th, launching 24 divisions of the French army, in addition to US, British, and Italian troops, and some 350 tanks. The aim was to eliminate the large German salient among the French lines. Turn to your partner and discuss who you believe won this battle. The Second Battle of the Marne developed into a significant Allied victory. After it became clear that the Germans not only had failed in their aim to win the war in this offensive, but had in fact lost ground, a number of German commanders, including the Crown Prince Wilhelm, believed that the war was lost. Since this battle was won by the Allies, simply add the year and a note for second. No further large-scale attempts to win the war were undertaken. The armies met in a train car at Compiègne, France, at 5:45 a.m. for a negotiation to the cessation of hostilities on the Western Front. The armistice, or break in fighting, took effect at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The peace would be negotiated over several months in Paris, with severe actions taken against Germany and other Central Powers. For our next activity, we will use your newly completed map and iPads. You will be asked to consider a guiding question, write a summary of your opinion, and share it with your elbow partner, and then participate in a class discussion. Using your notes and your map, write a paragraph that answers the question, which battle was the most significant and why? Make sure you provide a complete answer and support your opinion with evidence. Tell me why you think what you think. Now share your paragraph with your elbow partner. Do they agree with you? Disagree? What additional information would you need to convince them? Write down those questions below your paragraph. Now, using your iPads, look up the answer to at least 2 questions. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Look around the room. You will find labels for each of the battles we have discussed on the wall. Yes, time to stand up for what you think. Take your paragraph and additional notes and go stand under the sign that matches your selected battle. Compare notes with your classmates. After comparing notes, use the whiteboard walls to write down 3 of your strongest arguments or evidence points and designate a speaker for your group. In 10 minutes, we will have a class discussion to discuss which is the most significant battle. You now have heard all of the arguments provided. Did any of the arguments you have heard change your mind? Vote by staying in your spot or moving to a different sign. I will now count and record how many students changed location. Okay, please return to your seats and keep your map out for our final debrief of the activities. Most historians argue that the Battle of the Somme is the most important battle because of the British losses. The British offensive to break through the German lines near the Somme River was intended to be the big push that would end the war. A week of bombardments sent 1.6 million shells screaming into the German lines, but their damage was insignificant. When British troops attacked on July 1st, 1916, they suffered the greatest single-day loss in all of Britain's history, 60,000 casualties, 1/3 of which were kills. As the offensive dragged on, French troops came to reinforce the British. The losses for the Germans were significant as well, and instead of being the one action that would end the war, it entrenched the armies into a stronger stalemate. Both sides suffered greatly during the war, but Germany was largely blamed during the peace treaty negotiations for the human loss and destruction the war had brought. As such, the terms of the peace were especially harsh on Germany, a fact that would make it ripe for the rise of nationalism and Nazism a mere 15 years later. We will explore the peace treaty documents during our next lesson. Please collect your maps and iPads and leave the markers and supplies on the desk as you leave. Have a great day. Here are the references used in this presentation.